Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to cut through the noise and get straight to the most important insights on today's critical topics. If you're involved with CSOs, NGOs, or NGOs, you definitely know the sheer volume of information around sustainable growth, climate action, global development. It can feel absolutely overwhelming. New reports, shifting priorities, constantly evolving challenges. It really is a lot to keep up with. Today, we're taking a deep dive into a really powerful collection of insights from a recent major conference, and it's specifically designed to uncover the most critical challenges, but also perhaps some surprising opportunities for organizations just like yours.
That's exactly right. That's our mission today, to distill this incredibly complex landscape into, well, actionable takeaways for CSOs, NGOs, and NGOs. You are often right there on the front lines of global change. So we're going to explore the financial hurdles that might be blocking progress, look at the technological shifts opening new doors, and understand the social dynamics that fundamentally shape development efforts. We'll pull heavily from discussions around chapters 1, 4, and 7 of the conference material, but we'll touch on other key areas too. The goal is for you to walk away with a much clearer picture of the path ahead.
Okay, let's unpack one of the foundational ideas that really stood out to me. What's truly fascinating is how the whole conversation around climate change seems to have dramatically shifted from being seen as, a massive economic burden to potentially being an engine for growth. That's quite a mindset shift.
It really is. And one truly paradigm-shifting insight from the conference, which might surprise many who still view climate action as, well, a drag on economies, is this powerful assertion that net zero is net positive. Forget the old economic trade-off thinking. Studies, for example, from India are definitively proving that aggressively pursuing green technologies and decarbonization isn't just an environmental obligation, it's actually a profound economic accelerator. We're talking tangible benefits here, significant GDP growth, explosive job creation in new sectors, and even dramatically improved balance of payments by cutting that reliance on expensive fossil fuel imports. India, for instance, imports about $250 billion in fossil fuels every year. Imagine unlocking that kind of capital domestically.
That's a very compelling argument for the economic benefits. But okay, if net zero is truly so positive, so economically beneficial, why isn't this transition happening faster, especially, in the global south?
Yeah.
What are the biggest blockers? What's stopping it?
Well, the primary challenges identified are, first, a significant lack of financial resources. And second, the necessary technologies aren't always readily available or affordable for the global south to realistically transition by ambitious targets like 2060 or 2070. This isn't about minor tweaks. It really calls for massive systemic changes to the entire global financial architecture. The system we have now just isn't geared up for this scale of transformation.
Right. And what about the mechanisms being discussed to manage these costs and, incentivize change? We heard a lot about carbon pricing. What does that actually mean for the work organizations are doing, and how effective is it seen to be?
Economists tend to strongly favor carbon pricing, whether that's through taxes or cap-and-trade systems, for several pretty compelling reasons. First, it's generally seen as the most feasible approach for achieving meaningful emission reductions at scale, especially in large, complex economies with millions of emission sources. Second, it's considered the least costly, certainly in the short term, as it efficiently incentivizes reductions where they're cheapest to make. And third, and this is critical, it provides a long-term incentive for developing carbon-friendly technologies, innovation. Now, only about 15% of global CO2 emissions are currently covered by these instruments, so there's a long way to go. But it's seen as a critical tool. Plus, there's a powerful political argument. Reducing fossil fuel use brings significant local health co-benefits. Often, these health benefits are actually more valuable locally than the direct climate benefits themselves, which provides a strong reason for local action.
Okay, so beyond pricing, another new and intriguing concept emerged: a national flexibility mission. That's a fascinating term. What exactly is flexibility in this context? And why is it considered so vital for countries like India and, by extension, for organizations working in similar development contexts?
Yeah, flexibility. India faces this unique triple challenge. It needs to keep improving living standards for its huge population while operating within an increasingly narrow carbon budget and adapting to accelerating environmental change, all at the same time. So flexibility here means building the societal capacity to do new things quickly and efficiently. Think of it as societal agility. This could range from enabling farmers to switch crops easily as weather patterns change, to fostering rapid battery innovation for EVs, or building a resilient low-carbon infrastructure faster. It's presented as a kind of North Star goal. The focus is on reducing the frictions that stop change, rather than just relying on incentives alone.
That's a really powerful shift in focus from just incentives to actively reducing friction. I can see how identifying these essential inflexibilities could be crucial for organizations like ours working on the ground. But what do these micro constraints actually look like in practice? Can you give some specific examples that CSOs, NGOs, or NGOs should be looking for in their communities?
Oh, they can be incredibly varied and very localized. For businesses, it might be things like a lack of access to affordable credit, maybe challenges with logistics and transport, not enough insurance coverage, limited working capital, or a shortage of skilled labor. For individuals, these frictions could be a lack of the right skills for new green jobs, not having enough savings to risk a career change, or even deeply ingrained social expectations that discourage climate-friendly choices, like adopting new farming practices. The diagnostic phase of this mission involves really deep root cause analysis to pinpoint these very specific frictions holding things back.
So, for the CSOs, NGOs, and NGOs listening, how can our organizations practically contribute to this flexibility mission? Not just identify the problems, but actually help build that flexibility.
The recommendation is actually quite practical. It's about grouping initial flexibility investments as relatively small changes within existing agencies and programs. So rather than creating entirely new structures, for instance, if reskilling the workforce for green jobs is needed, the approach would be to build on and expand existing national skill development missions, adapt what's already there. Similarly, if access to credit is a big issue for local communities wanting to switch to cleaner fuels or technologies, the focus should be on expanding existing entrepreneurship programs or SME support through established channels. It's about leveraging and adapting existing frameworks for these new climate-friendly outcomes.
We're also seeing the real, tangible impacts of climate change right now, not just looking at projections. Which brings us to India's climate risks. They sound particularly alarming based on the reports.
They really are. India's climate risk atlas paints a concerning picture. 3/4 of its districts are already identified as hotspots for extreme weather events. That means a staggering 80% of Indians live in areas highly vulnerable to these impacts. But what's even more alarming are these so-called swapping trends. Areas traditionally prone to floods are becoming drought-prone, and vice versa. This severely challenges the administrative capacity on the ground. Local administrations set up for one type of disaster suddenly face the opposite, and they're often ill-equipped. It's a constant state of adaptation crisis.
Wow. That's a truly sobering figure, 80% highly vulnerable. It really underscores the urgency. And how does this immediate, tangible impact affect the fiscal space, especially for low-income economies that are already struggling?
Well, climate-related disasters hit low-income economies disproportionately hard. They often cost over 1% of their GDP annually. This puts a huge strain on their already limited fiscal space, meaning less money for education, health, essential services. The discussions highlighted some innovative solutions, though. Things like creating dedicated resilience reserve funds, developing de-risking platforms to attract private investment into adaptation, promoting a circular economy to reduce waste and resource dependency, and critically, addressing illicit financial flows, which rob these economies of absolutely vital revenue.
Okay, finally on this section, the jobs front. What's the outlook given this massive transition away from fossil fuels? Are we talking net job losses or gains overall?
It's definitely a nuanced picture, not just simple decline. Yes, there are certainly job losses in traditional sectors like coal. India alone has something like 13 million people formally employed in its coal sector, which is huge. But the clean energy sector is projected to create a substantial number of new jobs. Estimates suggest around 3.5 million full-time equivalent jobs by 2030. And there's a $50 billion investment opportunity in distributed energy alone, which could support maybe 37 million livelihoods. Plus, new industries like battery recycling, charging infrastructure for EVs. These can actively offset job losses from the shift away from internal combustion engines. So it's really a challenge of reskilling and reallocation, rather than a net job destruction scenario overall.
We've just discussed those immediate, tangible costs of climate change, not just environmental damage, but the fiscal burden too. This leads us perfectly into perhaps the biggest hurdle of all, mobilizing the sheer volume of finance needed for this global transition and adaptation. What's the estimated price tag for sustainable growth globally? And critically, where is all that money supposed to come from?
The consensus figure floating around the conference was roughly $3 trillion annually between now and 2030. That's the scale needed for sustainable growth globally. Now, the optimistic assumption is that about $2 trillion of this will need to come from domestic resources within countries themselves, which leaves a $1 trillion gap for external financing each year. And of that external trillion, the thinking is half, so $500 billion needs to come from private capital, and the other half from multilateral development banks, the MDBs, and other concessional financing.
$3 trillion annually. That really is a staggering amount. And half of that external finance from private capital. Given what we know about volatility and limited access for developing nations, how realistic is that target? What are the biggest hurdles in actually mobilizing private finance at that kind of scale?
You've absolutely hit on the core problem there. Private capital flows are notoriously volatile, and they're often severely limited for developing nations, especially for the kind of long-term sustainable projects we're talking about. A persistent, major challenge is currency risk. The costs of hedging against currency fluctuations can be extremely high, sometimes upwards of 4%, even for large, well-established Indian corporate groups. This can make many potentially viable green investments simply unaffordable. Private capital tends to chase low risk and high return, you see, and that combination often isn't perceived to be there in many emerging markets for these types of projects.
Right. And what about the failed financial systems? We heard discussions about the global debt architecture and the role of credit rating agencies. There seems to be a real bias talked about there.
Absolutely. The current global debt architecture is often described as informal, inefficient, and highly fragmented. And this leaves many low-income countries stuck in or very near severe debt crises. There's also a striking disparity, some would say bias, in credit ratings. An average advanced G20 country often has a near-perfect rating. Meanwhile, an emerging G20 country, even one with strong economic fundamentals, is frequently rated just a notch above junk status. This bias has a profound impact. It makes borrowing much more expensive than it perhaps should be, purely based on perceived risk rather than actual economic performance.
So what specific actions can be taken? What are the recommendations to make finance flows safer, more accessible for emerging markets and low-income countries? And maybe how can CSOs working on economic advocacy lean into these recommendations?
Several key recommendations came up. Strengthening global financial safety nets is one, things like the IMF's contingency lines, which, interestingly, have seen very limited use so far. There's also a strong call to regulate credit rating agencies more effectively to ensure fairer assessments for emerging countries. That's definitely an area CSOs could advocate on. Expanding central bank currency swap networks is another practical measure discussed. And advocating for greater symmetry in how advanced economies manage their monetary policy spillovers, because those can create huge volatility in developing markets. CSOs can play a vital role here by gathering real-world evidence on how these systemic biases affect communities and using that evidence to push for reforms.
And for the multilateral development banks, specifically the MDBs, what transformative reforms are needed there? They seem to be seen as absolutely key players.
They are key. MDBs like the World Bank Group currently lend around, $110, $120 billion annually. But to meet these global sustainable growth needs, they essentially need to triple that lending. They are really seen as the only institutions capable of providing support at this necessary scale, mainly due to their ability to leverage financial support from their shareholders. But to do this, they have to undergo transformative reforms themselves. This includes improving how they mobilize capital, enhancing project implementation on the ground, increasing transparency, and actively working to make sustainable infrastructure an attractive, recognizable asset class for private investors. It's not just about lending more money, it's about fundamentally changing how they operate.
That leads us directly to the human element, doesn't it? How are all these vast global trends, from climate change to these huge financial disparities, affecting inclusion and livelihoods, particularly in the global south?
Well, it's a mixed picture. While global poverty rates have certainly declined over the past few decades, which is good news, the rate of reduction in sub-Saharan Africa has been significantly slower than elsewhere. This unfortunately means that Africa's share of the world's poor has actually increased, and this demographic shift is deeply intertwined with a massive and really urgent jobs challenge facing the continent.
Jobs challenge, what does that actually look like on the ground for individuals and communities, especially with those staggering demographic projections you mentioned earlier?
The demographic projections are truly mind-boggling. By 2100, nearly half of the world's youth will be living in Africa. Now, this presents an immense demographic opportunity, of course, but also an absolutely immense need for employment. However, sub-Saharan Africa generally shows weak patterns of structural transformation. What that means is many workers moving out of agriculture aren't transitioning into stable, higher productivity wage employment. Instead, they're ending up in the informal sector. In fact, only about 13% of private sector workers in sub-Saharan Africa are currently in formal wage employment. It just highlights the sheer scale of the challenge to create decent jobs for millions upon millions of young people.
Okay, so what's a practical way for policymakers, and indeed for organizations listening, to address this lack of structural transformation? How can we help create better jobs that genuinely lift people out of poverty?
One concept that's gaining traction is product-based mappings. Think of it like charting a country's economic evolution strategically. It involves analyzing what a nation currently exports successfully, and then, crucially, identifying a clear pathway to diversify into closely related but higher value products, building on existing strengths. The example given was Ghana. It took them about 30 years to master the shift from just exporting raw cocoa beans to actually producing chocolate. That slow, deliberate movement up the value chain, leveraging existing capabilities to build new ones, that's the essence of building sustainable, inclusive growth. For CSOs, this could mean advocating for policies that support this kind of strategic industrial development, or maybe helping communities identify their own product space opportunities locally.
Let's bring this closer to home again with India's experience on inclusion. We hear so much about its impressive growth, but what about the impact on inequality and social progress within the country?
Well, India's high growth, along with China's, has actually been a major factor in the reduction of global inequality overall, which is sometimes overlooked. A significant driver of this, particularly within India, has been the dramatic expansion of education, especially reaching the poorest segments of the population. You see near gender equality in college education among the youth now in India, and remarkably high percentages of women in STEM fields, about 42% compared to maybe 31% in the US, and female pilots 15% in India versus a 3% global average. This educational revolution is truly transformative. It shows what focused investment in human capital can achieve.
So education is clearly a huge game changer there. What about wage trends? And how does that connect to poverty alleviation? We often hear conflicting reports on poverty data from India.
It's interesting. In India, one surprising trend since around 2011 is that unskilled workers' wages have actually increased faster than salaried workers' wages. That's a positive sign for the bottom of the economic pyramid. Now, as for poverty alleviation, yes, the data is debated. Some studies, often cited domestically, suggest India has almost eliminated extreme poverty, defining it as less than 1% living below a certain threshold. However, other international scholars, including the World Bank, present higher estimates, maybe in the 10-15% range. This significant difference really highlights a critical debate around data interpretation and measuring the true on-the-ground impact. It's vital for CSOs to understand this complexity when planning interventions and measuring their own success. It shows that even facts depend on how you measure them.
That really does underscore the challenge of accurate measurement and interpretation for all of us working in this space. And what about health? Its direct, undeniable connection to poverty seems crucial.
Absolutely crucial. Financial shocks from healthcare expenses are a major driver of impoverishment globally. People falling into poverty because of medical bills. In India, for example, it's estimated that catastrophic health expenditure pushes over 32 million people into poverty annually. Now, India's made progress. They've reduced out-of-pocket health spending from around 65% down to 47%, but that's still far from the global average of about 17%. So it indicates a clear and urgent area for continued focus and intervention. For CSOs working in health, this points towards advocating for stronger public health systems and financial protection mechanisms like insurance. And actually, when thinking about effective social protection, the Latin American experience offers some vital lessons, especially for CSOs thinking about system design. It really highlights the problem of having separate social insurance systems, maybe one for formal sector workers, another for informal one systems built around a person's specific job status. This kind of fragmented approach can inadvertently create weird disincentives that can make formal employment seem more expensive due to contributions. It's effectively taxing formality while sort of subsidizing informality by making that path seem less financially burdensome. The key takeaway here is not to mix up income transfers like cash support with social insurance programs like pensions or health coverage. Instead, the recommendation is to build core social protection systems, pensions, health, unemployment, outside of a worker's specific employment status, universal systems. This ensures everyone contributes to and benefits from the same social institutions. That's how you foster real inclusion rather than accidentally perpetuating divides based on job type.
Okay, beyond these deep dives into energy, finance, and social inclusion, our sources also touch briefly on other critical areas that organizations like yours probably need to be aware of. What's one key takeaway from Chapter 2 on technology that stood out?
Chapter 2 really highlighted the transformative power of AI. calling it a true general-purpose technology like electricity or the internet with the potential to boost global GDP by maybe 7%. That's huge. But perhaps even more relevant for listeners right now, it showcased India's digital public infrastructure, the DPI. It's seen as a powerful model for achieving rapid financial inclusion and formalization. India achieved in just 9 years what might typically take, say, 47 years using traditional methods, simply by allowing individuals and small businesses to join the formal economy digitally. What's also fascinating is how DPI can directly enable climate action, for example, by facilitating anticipatory climate financing, getting funds directly to vulnerable communities before a disaster hits.
And Chapter 3 brought up this idea of globalization and the fracturing global trading system. For CSOs working on economic development, what's the most crucial insight there?
It discussed the clear rise of protectionism and trade tensions globally. But it also pointed out an unexpected potential opportunity for countries like India through the China Plus One strategy, where global companies look to diversify their supply chains away from just China. The really crucial insight, though, is the renewed importance of industrial policy. It emphasized the need for countries to build robust domestic manufacturing capabilities again, supported by, the basics. Better access to finance, more R&D, improved infrastructure, skills development, and strategic exchange rate management. For CSOs, this means understanding how these big global trade shifts impact local economies and maybe advocating for policies that help local industries grow sustainably within that new context.
Finally, Chapters 5 and 6 really underscored the sheer urgency of finding a new multilateralism to face these escalating global commons challenges, climate, biodiversity, pandemics. What's the core message there for CSOs navigating this complex international landscape?
Well, the numbers are stark. We're talking about an estimated need of $5.4 trillion annually just for the SDGs, climate action, and nature conservation by 2030. This enormous scale and the sheer urgency demand that the multilateral development banks transform and play a significantly larger role, as we discussed. But the core message is broader. It's the need for a multilateral system that actually gives a greater voice to the global south, and one that actively bridges the gap between the social sciences, economics, sociology, and the natural sciences. We need to ensure that all economic activity fundamentally aligns with environmental sustainability. For CSOs, this really means being part of the advocacy for this more inclusive, more integrated global governance structure, pushing for that change.
Wow. What an incredible journey through these really complex global challenges, but also some of the innovative solutions being explored. It's become so clear that sustainable growth isn't just about economic models anymore, is it? It's deeply intertwined with technology, with nuanced social policy, and with profound international cooperation.
Precisely. And I think for organizations like yours listening, this deep dive really reveals the critical need for a multifaceted approach. It's about leveraging digital innovations, yes, but also advocating for those fundamental financial system reforms that address equity. And it's about designing truly inclusive programs that build that flexibility from the ground up, moving beyond just traditional incentives to tackle the underlying frictions that stop people from making sustainable choices. It really has to be about systemic change, not just, applying Band-Aid solutions.
So as you reflect on all of this, maybe consider this final provocative thought. In a world facing such immense and interconnected challenges, climate, inequality, financial instability, how can CSOs, NGOs, and NGOs best act as catalysts? Not just as implementers of projects, but as true catalysts driving the necessary systemic flexibility to translate these big global discussions into localized, tangible, sustainable impact. What stands out to you as the biggest leverage point?